Do you think this city in this picture can solve the problems of resource consumption?
Well, it can be better for people to live in a densely populated area than to just sprawl out over the land and then like all the land is used versus maybe, you know, if everyone's here, there can still be land where they can get their resources that isn't being lived on in the same way.
So if we have an area of land that's, let's say, 100 square miles, and we were able to put everybody's residence into 20 square miles, that would leave us 80 square miles to still grow all of our food, have open areas, forest, water that's not impacted by that. Would that be a good thing? As opposed to having the people spread out through the entire area and having smaller chunks of land broken up in little chunks of forest, little chunks of open area, little areas for farming?
Theoretically, that's better, but it's complicated because it's not like that.
That would also be kind of dangerous because we'd be more susceptible to things like natural disasters. Like, I'm looking at those tall skyscrapers and I'm thinking, if we put everyone in the same place and a tornado went through, that would level off half our population right there.
Also, it increases the likelihood of people getting ill and diseases passing quickly through people. But it could decrease our footprint. I'm going to tell you, I think urbanization is both a good thing and a bad thing. I think it has aspects of both. How I have to talk about it. As opposed to why you should care about urbanization, well, you probably may already live there. By 2012, 51% of the world and 79% of Americans lived in an urban area. So about 80% of our population lives in urban areas. That may not be a city, but it's still an urban area. And urban areas are growing rapidly all the time. The way that we have currently structured urban areas, they have a very large ecological footprint because the urban area has a large suburban area around it that supports it. And then outside of that, you might eventually get to areas where food is grown. Also, the air and the water pollution that come from urban areas are significant. The solid waste that's produced in a city is massive. And you're constantly bringing in goods from elsewhere, polluting other areas as you ship them in. And then the urban areas also tend to exploit the rural areas near them for their supplies. For food, yes, but for metal, for wood, for other natural resources. Cities can have benefits. You concentrate the people, it becomes more efficient. If you lived and worked in Philadelphia, do you think you could probably utilize the public transportation system easily? Like I said, for me, I have to go all the way into the city and then all the way back out. But if I lived and worked in a city, I wouldn't have to do that. I could just go from one side of the city to another. There's also preservation of land and ecosystems that's available if you concentrate the people better. There's less areas around them that they're going to be using. You can also conserve topsoil if you concentrate the area where people are living because you're not destroying topsoil as you build large, sprawling housing developments. The goal of urban living today should be sustainable urban living. Let's see how many of these words you guys are familiar with. What's an urban area? How do we define it? What number of people do you need to have in a city for it to be considered urban?
50,000.
Much smaller.
Smaller. 30, 25, 10.
2,500. An urban area It's a city of at least 2,500 people in it.
How big's the city though?
That may be defined by the land area.
I was gonna say.
Yeah,
Like,
so
when I was just in South Dakota, like I passed through some towns, and it was like population like 13 or like 2,500, whatever, and that would be in no ways defined as urban. But I mean, that town might have been, I don't know.
yeah. So the town may be considered urban, but what's around it is the rural area.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, your textbook uses the idea of 2,500 people in a city as being an urban area. I don't know that I agree with them either. In most places, you're used to the idea of something not qualifying as a city until there's at least 10,000 people living in it, or maybe 50,000 people living in it. So it may be then a non-populated urban area if it has 2,500 people. Does anyone know if their town that they grew up in has less than that? Because my town's pretty tiny, but it has 5,000 people. So I'm not sure I agree with that number either. A rural area is then an area where there are people, but it's not an urban area. A lot of us use the word suburban for the areas that might be like the 2,500 people to like even the 50,000 people. Is this area urban?
No.
No. Is Philadelphia urban?
Yes.
So in our minds, we think of this as suburban, that you have your urban areas, which are your highly concentrated groups of people, where it's not just the number of people, but the density of people. And then suburban becomes a little bit more spread out. And then rural are areas usually where we think that there's agriculture happening. Is that how the rest of you tend to think of these areas? So, yeah, I tend to also disagree with your book that 2,500 people constitutes an urban area. Maybe I'll come up with some numbers for Friday and we'll vote and see what we think it should be. I'll come up with a couple more definitions. What's an MDC and an LDC? These are our more and our less developed countries. It is important to note that just because something is less developed does not make it inferior. As a matter of fact, most people would argue that our countries that are less developed have a superior understanding of their culture and their traditions than our countries that are in fact more developed, because they actually have a cultural identity. Does that idea make sense? We use economics as a metric in frequently looking at countries because it's a way to level the playing field, but only really if I'm looking from a capitalistic perspective, I guess you could argue. Population density, do you know that? Do you understand what that means? How many people we have living per area? And then urban growth is going to be the rate of an increase of an urban population. We usually express that as a percentage per year. So the top picture there, that large city with all of the lights in the horizon, is Mexico City. This is a suburb in Southern California, and the bottom picture is from Malawi. All of these technically are urban areas. How is urban different in these three pictures? And the top two are considered on the more developed end, and the bottom one clearly on the less developed end. Mexico City, if you weren't aware, is one of the largest cities in the world. There's 21 million people. It's in some ways considered an environmental disaster. How do you describe the top two? There's a lot of things in common, right? Compared to the bottom, houses, constructed houses with roads, with electricity, lots of people. The difference between Mexico City and Southern California is property and driveways and single family homes as opposed to apartment living. Bottom, for most of us, that doesn't constitute our idea of a city. It's a grouping of houses constructed out of natural materials. Do you see similarities though? What?
Just they group together.
Group together pretty closely at that too, right? Out of curiosity, how many of you want to be further away from your neighbors than the people are there in that suburb of Southern California? Okay. This is looking at urban population growth. More developed nations, less developed countries in the world, population is growing in urban areas. Okay. The graph kind of shows us that. And it shows us what our predictions are by 2030. By 2030, how many people do you see according to that graph that will be living in urban areas?
Almost
5 billion people. What type of graph would you say, or what type of growth does that look like? Exponential or logistic? For the more developed countries, it's a logistic growth. It's kind of reaching like what appears to be a carrying capacity. The other two look more exponential. And there's a problem here. Because urbanization has increased from about 20% of the population living in urban areas from 1850 to greater than 50% of the population living in urban areas today. It's a pretty small time period for that change in how we live. And we expect that by 2050, it could be that 70% of the world's population lives in urban areas. Are our cities made for 70% of the people in a country to be living in them? So what do you think the main problems are other than this massive increase and not enough time to keep up with it? Where do we see the highest growth of people living in the urban areas? Our less developed countries, which could have 88% of their populations living in cities by the end of the 21st century. The number of urban areas in the world is growing. There were 400 cities in the world with more than 1 million people by 2012. We had 22 mega cities. A mega city has 10 million people. 19 of those 22 were in our less developed countries, where they don't have the infrastructure perhaps to support the people that are living there. We have 2 hypercities. How big do you think a hypercity is? Over 20 million. Mexico City is 21. What is the most populous city in the world? Tokyo, with 36 million people as of 2012. Which is on an island. They can't go anywhere else. Well, they could. Can we live currently beneath the ocean? Not in a city form yet. That's going to have to be the next step, though, if the cities are continuing to grow. A byproduct of so many people living in a concentrated area without the infrastructure to support it is poverty. So you put all of these people in the same area. There's not enough jobs. There's not enough schools. There's not enough supplies. There's not enough resources. The price of things goes up. Poverty is the result.
How is Japan doing though with that? Because isn't Japan more developed and not?
They're very well developed. Yeah.
Poverty?
Yeah, they are. They seem to be handling it really well. One of the things that they've done that we are really bad at is they've adapted to living in a smaller area with a smaller footprint. That's just part of the concept. You want to live in Tokyo, so you understand, much like people moving to New York would understand. Well, okay, some people moving to New York understand. If you were to move to Manhattan today, how many of you think that you would probably get a studio apartment if you were lucky. That's where we would end up, right? That's actually, let's face it. Unless one of you has a whole lot more money than I'm thinking you do, I don't think any of us can afford to go rent an apartment in Manhattan. I cannot. I do not nearly make enough to do that. But we understand that there's a cost with going there. You're going to be in a smaller area. But it doesn't mean that there aren't people that would say, well, no, I really want like the penthouse, 5-bedroom, 6-bathroom. So we still have that idea in our culture that having more than we need is good. It's better. It's a status symbol. I want that large apartment. They've somehow circumvented part of that, which is helping in the Japanese culture. And this is where cultural identity, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, comes into play with environmental concerns. Who wants to have a house on the water or a house on an ocean? Who wants a beach property or a cabin in the mountains along with an additional residence? Isn't that what you're told in the American dream you can have? I remember I had a professor in college, who was one of my biology professors, and he asked us how many of us wanted to have a beach house. And a lot of us in class were like, well, sure. And he was like, you're horrible people. He was like, no, you can't have a beach house. That's horrible. You shouldn't want that. You don't need that. One house is enough. And he was like, plus, then we're just building on the beaches and destroying them. So get over wanting a house. This is looking at what those populated cities are and where they're found. Yeah. So people leave the farms, they need to find jobs someplace. Where do jobs tend to be? In the city. And then what happens? People don't want to live in the city, right? They want a little bit of property, a little bit of land, some green. So they move to the suburbs and they move slightly further out. And then what happens? Other people want to move slightly further out and the suburbs start becoming built up. So then people will move slightly further out again. We call that process suburbanization. The idea that people are constantly trying to spread further and further from the urban centers to have more land available to them. And people link having more land to decreased crime rates, better education, wealth. There's some idea that people who have more property have more wealth. Now, that may not entirely be true, because I think we can pretty safely say that people in Radnor, on average, probably have more money than the people living on the outskirts of like Lancaster and York cities, even though people living in Lancaster and York counties may have more property than the people in Radnor. People in Radnor just have a lot of money because these houses cost, well, some of them in the multi-millions of dollars. In case you wondered why most of your professors don't live near Eastern, we don't make multi-million dollar salaries. If any of you would like to buy us a house, I'm sure we would share it. Like Dr. Lutz commutes from Ephrata, Pennsylvania, for those of you that know where that is. It's a pretty long commute. It's over an hour, yes. Which is why when you see him here at like 6 o'clock in the morning, that's why. He's like, there's way less traffic at 6 a.m. Oh, he leaves his house at like 5. But he has a house with some property that they love, and his wife likes it out there. They like the country, although it means for some odd reason they still have all of their doctors here, so she comes in with him often enough. And sometimes they bring the dog, and that's great because he has a golden doodle who's very friendly. This is some of the benefits, some of the drawbacks to living in urban areas. You all identified probably more than the textbook has, so that was awesome. And this is a way of looking at the inputs and the outputs from cities. Cities cover about 2% of the Earth's surface, only about 2%, but they use a considerably higher percentage of resources than other areas. So their physical footprint is much, much smaller than their ecological footprint. Anyone know what city this is? Denver is a really good guess, but not Denver. Close. This is definitely someplace with some elevation nearby. Someplace that has a lot of deserts near it.
Las Vegas?
It is Las Vegas. 1984, 2010. What do you notice? That area of green, by the way, what do you think that green is? This is an aerial photograph. Some of it's golf courses, lawns. So that gives you an idea. How much green is there in the 1984 picture, comparatively? Not very much. So this is probably a desert area. You add in golf courses and lawns. What do you think happens to your water consumption? Massively increases. In Clark County, Nevada, between 1970 and 2010, they went from about 225,000 people in 1970 to over 2 million people 40 years later. That was almost a 9 to 10 times increase in the amount of people. So first obvious problem is water. What else do you think happens as an urban problem here? Bringing in all the food, all the pollution that comes with bringing all the food. And then the food is not going to be as fresh because there is no place to grow produce in the desert well. Let's imagine for a moment, you wake up tomorrow and there's 10 times as many students on Eastern's campus as there were today. What would the problems be here?
Housing and parking.
Housing, parking. The cafeteria, you're never going to get any food. How much bigger your class is going to be. And heaven help you if you have a professor with the grades on a curve. Because a whole lot more people are going to fail. On a bell curve, that is. You have to have an equal number of A's and F's. I don't believe in that idea. Because it's crazy. But some people still do. How much more difficult would your life be with 10 times as many people on this campus this size? It's kind of the same problems we can have sometimes in cities. But not only in cities. When I was in grad school, I lived in Lewis, Delaware. Do you guys have an idea where Lewis is? It's at the beach. So yeah, I lived a mile from the ocean. Well, I guess a mile from the bay, maybe a mile and a half from the ocean for a while. It was pretty nice. I'm not going to lie about that. But I would also tell you that almost all of the time that I was at the beach, almost all of the time I was doing research. So that makes it less fun. But the school district there is Cape Henlopen School District. They had to build a new high school because the rate of suburbanization down there was so rapid, they had run out of room in their school buildings for all of the students they had in the area. They had not quite this level of population growth, but I think their population had increased something like threefold in 30 years. So it had massively grown. They had to build new schools for all of the students. And they had to hire a consultant to figure out how much could things continue growing. And urban sprawl is defined as the spreading of low-density housing and other forms of development around the city centers. So you start chunking it up and building your suburbs. Urban sprawl, suburbanization are the same type of things. And what happens in urban sprawl is you take people that were concentrated in the city and you spread them out a little bit. You're increasing their physical footprint on the earth, but you're also increasing their ecological footprint or their environmental impact. Because suddenly, well, if you had farms just outside of the city, now they're slightly further because you have houses just outside of the city. It means food's going to have to travel further. It also means that people can't as readily use public transportation because they're slightly further out and maybe the public transportation isn't there yet. So you'll have more people driving. You have this diffuse population then. They need to find a way into the city because that's where the jobs are. And they start consuming resources from the whole surrounding area. So now the city, instead of having a small ecological footprint, has a much larger one. But your people are happier. They have cleaner air to breathe overall. They own more land. They think they're in better schools, and so forth and so on. So people become happier. So that is a benefit to urban sprawl and suburbanization, is happy people. But you lose natural land and agricultural areas in order to do this process of suburbanization. So areas that have been used for farming, you might find that a farmer's approached and he said, all right, listen, we're going to give you $10 million for your farm here. If you're a farmer, is that going to be hard to turn down? Absolutely, because $10 million is going to take you may never make that as a farmer. And then the farm is torn up and we build houses instead. There's a development that's going up in what used to be some farming, well, cattle grazing fields on, is it Newtown Road and Darby Hill, like not far from here. I think, Doctor, you said it's the old Wanamaker's, not Wanamaker, it's one of the old estates that's near here. It used to be a farm. It's been sold for housing, and they're putting up houses in an area that used to be open farm fields. They haven't done actual farming on it for a while. The people who own the farm next to them have been using it for grazing land for their cattle. Did you know that there were cattle near campus? Those of you that have been to the Willows, it's right near there. Where we turned one direction through the Willows, we go a little bit further out. It's right near there. And we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of houses coming up there. And I think they're doing townhomes because you can get more houses if you do townhomes rather than homes with their own separate lawns and separate buildings. So they will make more money in the long run. I still don't think that they will be affordable housing for any of us. And with the conversion of natural land, one of the things that we tend to not think about is that that's just not the idea of you build a house on it. Pavement changes everything about an area. What happens when it rains and you have a paved surface? Get runoff and puddles. What happens when it rains and it's on an area where there's grass and trees and soil? Goes into the ground, recharges your groundwater. So if you have a lot of paved areas, you're going to have a reduction in the amount of water going into recharging your groundwater in an area. And sorry, I can't get these apparently today to link. I'm always one slide behind you guys on my computer. These are some undesirable impacts for urban sprawl. Increased energy use, waste, we've talked about these, loss of cropland, increased use of water, decline, surprisingly, on a social impact. When we see suburbanization, it also leads to a decline in businesses in the city. It leads to falling house prices in the city. It leads to higher rates of unemployment as everything moves and spreads out slightly further. What do you see in these two pictures? This is, for those of you wondering where these pictures are, this is in Los Angeles and the highway coming into and going out of Los Angeles. What do you see? Other than a place none of you want to live.
That's a lot of light pollution.
That's a whole lot of light pollution. Could you even tell that was nighttime? Think of all that electricity use. And what about this? Worst traffic jam of your life? Do you think you could live in LA without a car? In LA? Yeah. especially if you take Uber. I don't know how much public transportation they have, but if you use taxis, Ubers, they do have some public transit. Not as much as we have here. Could you live 20 miles outside of LA with a car? Or without a car? Not so well. No. And part of it is that in areas where cities are growing faster than their planned growth, it tends to outpace their public transportation systems and a lot of the other structures that would allow people to move easily in and out from the city. So in areas where we haven't planned for, how many of you agree that in the United States you probably need a car? Yeah. Maybe not right now, but at some point soon you will, in fact, need a car. Okay. So how much of the world's population does that say we are? 4.5%. But we own 33% of the cars. We use 43% of the gasoline. And 98% of all transportation in U.S. urban areas is cars. All right, well, cars. Maybe air pollution. We have the fastest growing gasoline growth in carbon-based air pollution. We have air pollution on streets, on highways, in parking lots, driveways. All the places produce lots and lots of air pollution. About half of U.S. urban land has cars on it at some point in time, producing air pollution kind of around the clock. The air pollution doesn't just stay in the air. A lot of it's going to settle out on the ground surface. Especially in cold weather, things are going to settle out on the ground. As they do, it may actually become incorporated in water pollution and water. So cars cause air pollution, sure. Cars cause us to need a place to put them. A place for them to park, a place for them to ride. You need to make more and more paved surfaces all the time. But cars are a public health concern. They kill people. They injure them. How many accidents do you think injure people in cars worldwide a year? Or how many people are injured in car accidents worldwide a year? Remember, there's something like 7.5 billion people.
Probably hundreds, somewhere in that range.
15 million people per year worldwide are injured in car accidents. How many of those are in the United States?
13 million?
Much lower. 5. We don't have that. So there's some sort of interesting disparity there, right?
Just need good traffic laws. Like a lot of places don't even have any traffic laws.
But we still get a third of the injuries from car accidents happen here. But we also have a third of the world's motor vehicles, so that kind of makes sense. You would expect, given our traffic laws, that we would perhaps have fewer. When I was in Israel, I was shocked because, you know, we always hear like, oh my gosh, like in New York, or I grew up in Pennsylvania, so we always heard like in New Jersey, people are crazy, like they drive on the sidewalk. So if you're from New Jersey, I apologize. Is anyone from New Jersey? Great, good. I've never seen a car drive on the sidewalk until I was in Israel. I watched cars drive up on the sidewalk, come within literal inches of running down people, honking and going like 40 miles an hour, like down the sidewalk as people are like diving out of their way, and then going around things, going over like medians. I think one time we watched one like hit a pedestrian like bench, like a bus stop bench, because like it wasn't being careful. Sometimes you would see cars going both directions on the sidewalk, barely, because we're all stopped in traffic. That was terrifying. In other places in the world, there are almost no traffic laws. You were in India. What was it like there?
It
really scary to drive.
People are just doing everything, right?
Yeah, and it just takes, like, even if you're going a very short distance, it takes a really long time because there's so much traffic.
Have you watched The Amazing Race? They're always. Any of you feel like you would do The Amazing Race only if you didn't have to like drive cars everywhere? Because they get to these intersections and there's no stop signs, no traffic lights, and you're just like, who goes? And it's like, don't kill me. I'm gonna slowly creep through the intersection. This is where there's a difference, though. Worldwide, 1.2 million people die from car accidents every year. In the United States, it's less than about 30,000. Our safety laws make us less likely to die from a car accident, much less likely to die from a car accident than elsewhere in the world. So our safety does provide us with that. But cars, and we have the resource use that goes along with cities. And water is our biggest concern. Or alternatively, water is the biggest concern I'm going to talk about because I like to talk about water. For those of you that don't know my background very well, I worked in water chemistry and water resource things in undergrad and all throughout graduate school. So I could teach, if they let me, an entire course. I would love to teach an entire course on just like hydrology and water use and water pollution, but unfortunately we don't get to do that. Maybe if we get student demand, we can. Where do we get our water from? Here. We have a reservoir that we get our water from here. Where do you get your water from at home?
Well,
You have a well? Okay. So, do all of your wells work pretty good about supplying you with water?
yeah.
We get a lot of water from groundwater, either from wells or from pumping aquifers. And aquifers, for those of you not familiar with that word, think of them as kind of like underground lakes. They are groundwater. So it's under the ground and you're able to tap into them and pump it out. But we pump aquifers in the US about 25% faster than their replenishment rate. So we pipe them 25% as fast as they're able to be recharged through natural methods. That's on average. In the West, we pump them much faster than that to support agriculture. This is not the only time you're going to hear me say this. I don't think we should be growing lettuce in the desert. One of my main concerns with the misuse of water in the United States is that we're doing agriculture in areas that should not be supporting it. We should be doing agriculture in areas where there's enough rainfall to support the crops that we're growing. And instead, we irrigate things in areas where there's not enough groundwater and there's not enough surface water flow in order to grow food. We should find a way to do this better. We also take surface water. Where does LA get its water from?
You get it from snowpack in the Sierra Mountains.
Part of it comes from snowpack. They have these lovely things called the aqueduct system. Think of them as concrete-lined rivers. They bring in water that they've diverted from elsewhere, some of it from snowmelt, some of it from other surface water sources. Colorado River. Where should it end?
Mexico.
In Mexico, in the Pacific Ocean. Where does it end?
New Mexico, for example.
Many years it doesn't make it to the Pacific Ocean much anymore. Some years it doesn't make it far into Mexico, or there's not much water that makes it into Mexico. Does Mexico every so often threaten us over our misuse of their surface water? Absolutely. But we say, well, the water's here so we can use it. And when we talk more about groundwater, one of the things that you're going to learn to think about, if you don't already think about it this way, is that there's always somebody downstream of you that always also deserves some access to that water, and that water should also be clean for them. So whatever I take out from here means there's less down here, And whatever pollutant I put in up here is going to go downstream to other people. We drain areas, and as we drain water from areas, it changes the ecosystems that are found there. So misuse of water also changes the types of ecosystems we have. And when we have bad drought, years of drought, systems may not be able to recover. This is looking at groundwater overdraft in the US. This area here is the Ogallala Aquifer. It's the largest aquifer in the United States. It may even be the largest aquifer in the world. It's massive. It underlies many states. It underlies the areas where we do a lot of our agricultural growth. For those of you that have heard complaints about oil pipelines running through that area, one of the reasons we've been concerned about it is because oil pipelines are allowed to leak. Oil, much like water, when it gets on top of the ground surface, will sink in. So the concerns about putting oil pipelines over the areas of recharge for the Ogallala Aquifer are that we will be putting oil directly into the groundwater, which we then use to irrigate our crops, which means we're irrigating our crops with oil-contaminated water. So it's not just that people don't want pipelines going through, it's that we don't want leaky pipelines going through areas that supply our water for our agricultural needs. But with urbanization, where you have people centered here and here and here and here, you need to move the oil from over there to where the people are. So you need some way of moving it. This is looking at the flow of the Colorado River. Since 1905 until, I think it's like 2004 that it goes until. The Colorado River supplies people, about 30 million people in 7 states with water. What do you notice about the construction of the dams as it relates to water flow? Reduced it? Except what do you think is going on in 1985? Something happened, dam broke, lots of snow melt, lots of flooding rains. Some combination of things happened in order to increase floodwaters. You can open your food. This is showing you in that picture, in this picture, and this one. So 3 of the pictures are showing you aqueducts, another showing you a water pipeline. Anybody live near a stream or a river? What does the ecosystem around it look like? Lots of plants, lots of brush. What lives in the river or the stream? Fish, frogs, maybe some turtles, some aquatic invertebrates, some plants. What do you think lives in these?
Mosquitoes.
Yeah. So still some aquatic inverts, not the same. How about fish? How about frogs and turtles and salamanders? Lots of bacteria. Where are the trees? There's 2 problems here with the lack, well, one major problem with the lack of trees. Trees provide shade. Shade decreases temperature, which decreases evaporation rates. So in areas with aqueducts, without shade over them, without tree cover, there's actually a massive increase in evaporation and warm temperatures. So trees on a river don't just serve to provide health to the ecosystem, they also provide shading, which decreases water loss through evaporation. In urban areas where you've cut down all of your trees and you're moving water from place to place, you're dealing with loss of water, not just through lots of people using it, but also misuse in how we're moving it from place to place. I think you're all seeing that these are all kind of fitting together. A lot of it dealing with our misuse of land. Resource uses that we need to support things in the city. Well, we need wood. None in the US is much for firewood, but we do need firewood. Building materials. Yeah, we need to build things. Build them out of wood. We also need space to put your houses, space for schools, for business parks, for things like that. And as you reduce the amount of trees you have, you reduce the ability to store carbon dioxide. So that's allowing more and more carbon dioxide to be liberated into the atmosphere. We see farmland going to houses, which is a bad use of topsoil. Soil that is healthy for agriculture probably should be left to be able to be used for agriculture, because houses can be built almost anywhere. Whether or not they should be built there is a totally different story. But good farmland is hard to find. There's mineral uses that we need for the way that we do our lives. Then there's the non-renewable resources: oil, gas, coal. For mineral resources, just for a moment, let's think about all of our electronics and the minerals and things that go into making them. There's a lot of things we need in order to do our daily lives that require resource use. And we already talked about pollution a little bit. There's the air pollution. And urban areas do create the most of it. 2.4 million people die each year worldwide because of air pollution. 24,000 people in the US. Over 650,000 people die in China every year from air pollution related diseases. This may mean deaths from emphysema, chronic bronchitis, asthma, that are triggered to react to the air pollutants, but it may be from other things that they breathe in. Acid deposition happens when we burn fossil fuels. They release the NOx, so NO2, NO or gases. We call the NOx gases, the NOx gases. And then the SOx gases, or the SOx gases, the SO2, SO3, convert to nitric and sulfuric acid in the atmosphere with water vapor. As they do, that will start to leave the atmosphere through one of two ways. The one you're used to is acid rain, also acid snow, so really acid precipitation. But the other is direct deposition, that in areas that are remarkably humid, those acids are just going to directly deposit themselves with the hot, or even for that matter, cold fog and humidity that settles into areas. So we see both direct and dry deposition versus that precipitation. And then we have greenhouse gases, which do lead to climate change. This is an area of, well, forest. What do you notice about the trees? They are dead. What tells you they are dead? No needles, no branches, no health. We got a couple healthy trees in there, although a couple of them might very well be cell phone towers. Do any of you have the cell phone towers near you that they've made look like pine trees?
Yeah.
And there's one on 95, right next to 95 near my house. Yeah. What do you think caused this? No, not fire.
Probably acid rain.
Acid deposition. And acid rain does more than just kill the trees outright. It also increases their susceptibility to diseases and to bacterial infections and to fungal infections. And it reduces the beneficial insects and animals in the area. So it is a multifold problem. As we talk more about air pollution, we'll come back to that. And we'll come back to water pollution later, but it's safe to say that urban areas do cause higher amounts of water pollution than other places. Factories discharge directly into areas. People throw their waste in the water. There's runoff from areas, from lawns that are fertilized that don't need to be fertilized, and golf courses that provide as much, if not more, runoff in fertilizers than farming areas do. We have noise pollution. We have light pollution. Municipal solid waste also becomes a problem. When you're in the city, things have more packaging than things tend to have elsewhere because you have to ship things in. So there is more packaging and there's more trash that's with that. With a concentration of people, you also have a high likelihood for more recycling to be available. So maybe there's a way to recycle better in urban areas than there is elsewhere. And urban areas have a lot of e-waste. What is e-waste? Electronic waste. How do you get rid of an old television? In the state of Pennsylvania, you absolutely cannot put it out for your trash men to take. You get a fine. How do you get rid of one?
Just take it to a dump. I don't know.
Sometimes you can take it to a dump and you can pay.
They have like electronic recycling drives.
Mm-hmm. Best Buy used to take them back. Now they will for like I think $50 surcharge. Same thing with Staples and places like that. My town has an electronic waste recycling day, I think next Saturday. And lead paint and things like that you can take back. Hazardous chemicals you can take to townships and counties that have hazardous recycling days, so you can dispose of those things safely. There's a couple companies that make nail polish that are considered 5 free, that are free of the top 5 toxins, because a lot of cheap nail polish contains formaldehyde, you know, the thing that we use to preserve dead creatures for dissection. Because clearly you want to paint that on your nails and then get it into your body as you eat food with your hands, right? There are a number of the companies that make the nail polishes that are free of that will allow you to send them, usually on Earth Day, any bottles you have of old nail polish that does contain those chemicals, and they will safely dispose of it. One of the brands that does that is Zoya. And they usually let you kind of get a couple of theirs for free to help get people to exchange things that are chemically bad for you for things that are better for you. And landfills. Trash is bad. Trash smells bad. Trash breeds bacteria. It also concentrates rats, and rats bring diseases. So municipal solid waste is an issue. And no one wants to live in this. One of the things that we've started doing in order to get rid of our trash is we ship it to other countries. Other countries buy our trash from us. And then people work through the trash and they try to get things through it that they can then recycle to make money. We'll talk about this, I think it's in chapter 14 again, because this is a human justice issue. We will pick up with this